so we're going to get started. And once again, I'm glad you're all here. And we will begin with a word of prayer and then a few comments in the lesson. Father, we do thank you that we can be here. We thank you, Lord, that you have given us truth to guide us. Help us use that truth to be effective for you. Pray that you would guide and direct our discussion. My thoughts, Lord, that they might be your thoughts, that I might say what you once said. And I pray that they would hear what you want heard and use and act on it. And we would thank you for these things. Thank you again for your goodness and your mercy and all you have done for us. Help us to be effective for you. Okay, we're going to look at worldviews again today, but first, given the events of this week, I think it's important to address something. I did not follow Charlie Kirk as much as maybe I should have. I knew he was politically active. I knew he was incredibly effective. I did not know how much he brought biblical values into his messages. That amazed me. And it reminded me that all I am doing here, and other people as well, he was doing what we should be doing. He was willing to walk into the lion's den and say, if you disagree with me, come to the front of the line. I want to talk to you. That's courage. And that's being effective. I just read this morning that Turning Point USA has had 18,000 requests for new chapters since Wednesday. That's what we should be doing. End of politics. Okay? Get into the lesson. Last week we were looking at worldview. We're going to continue looking at worldview today. Remind you that everybody has one. Not everybody has an effective one, but everybody has one. And they give us an ability to view and understand the world that we live in and be able to interact in it effectively. We looked at a test for a worldview, the idea that it ought to make sense. There should be no contradictions in it. And it should relate to the real world, and it should be possible to live it consistently, regardless of what happens. You shouldn't have to change it every few days or minutes or hours or whatever. We looked at the fact that they develop over time, and we looked somewhat at the fact that they impact culture, but I didn't finish that. So what I want to do today is go on and look again at the way worldviews impact culture, and then the way events impact worldviews, because it's a two-way street. So anyway, worldviews influence social structures. They influence the guardrails that keep us in line, that keep us focused and moving in the right direction. Those are laws, governments, education, economics, all those sorts of things. A worldview will have an effect on laws. Laws started out in America, at least, and in the West, after Christianity spread, laws were biblically rooted in revealed truth. They were based on what God said was right and wrong. They were based on the Ten Commandments and morality. They acted as guardrails for our conduct in culture, in the world. As things changed, they became rooted in the needs of the state. And it became a point where justice was whatever served the interest of the state at the moment. Now, as I say these things, you might think to yourself, yeah, I see that today. Yeah, you're right, okay? And we will see more of that as we go through this. Morality, when it's separated from legality, law becomes a tool of power. If morality is not linked to law, or a law linked to morality, then law becomes simply a tool for power, not for virtue. The effect on freedom, individual freedom versus collectivism. This is a big thing. And a society built on individual is going to prioritize personal freedoms. Western civilization, since the Reformation, has prioritized the individuals, largely due to Martin Luther's emphasis on the priesthood of the believer. We individually account to God for what we do. We individually follow God. That was monumental when it happened. That was earth-shaking. That was totally different from the Roman Catholic view at that time. That has changed things. So Western civilization since then has prioritized the individual. The collectivist mindset prioritizes the group. The group is what's important, and today the state is what's important, not the individual. The individual has to fall in line with whatever the state wants. In a real effect, the state has become God, or wants to become God, and we need to bow down to it. How we view freedom, our worldview concept of freedom, will affect how we believe and how we live and where we live. There are two extremes to this. This is an easy one almost. The American nation, 1776, was built on a biblical Christian worldview, and it was very influential, obviously, in shaping our nation. Enlightenment rationalism, that's a philosophical time period we'll get into later. But that contributed the ideas of natural rights and checks and balances to what we were putting together as a government. But it prioritized individual freedoms. The Bill of Rights. We are free to speak. We are free to associate. We are free to worship. Those are freedoms that aren't granted by the government, but are inherent in us as people. A right is that thing that you can exercise without anybody else's help, without needing anybody else to do it. You can speak. You can think. You don't need somebody else to make it possible for you to think or to speak. That's a right. Healthcare is not a right, because healthcare requires somebody else to take care of me to keep me healthy. That's not a right. But we get confused in those kinds of things as things go on. Anyway, the American nation instituted freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all those kinds of things. It also instituted a limited government to ensure that we are able to function well and use those rights as we see fit. In direct contradiction to that, in France in 1790, there was a revolution based on an atheistic philosophy. It prioritized the group over the individual. You either conformed or you lost your head. It was that simple. A whole different viewpoint. The American one was based on biblical principles. The French one was based on the priority of the state. The worldview was changed. That changed how people think. Economics. There's free enterprise versus state-managed markets. Adam Smith in 1776 revolutionized economics with his book called Wealth of the Nations. It assumed that people are rational agents, that they can make valid decisions that benefit them, that make sense to them. They don't need somebody else to tell them that. And a market functions best with minimal interference. Smith's ideas aligned with a lot of the ideas at that moment, and the Protestant assumptions about personal responsibility and decentralized authority. That all changed in 1867 when Karl Marx wrote Das Kapital. And that changed economics from us making free choices in the marketplace as to what we want and what will benefit us, to the government saying, you need to do what we tell you to do. It led to economic systems where states manage production, pricing, and labor, often at the cost of personal freedom. We see that today. Education changed. And again, all of these are worldviews, ideas that changed how we perceive things, that changed laws, that changed economics, that changed freedom. Education was the same way. It went from character building to secular standardization. Education is never neutral. Understand that. Education always educates to a purpose, to a point. Always. You're not going to get away from that. I can't imagine a totally neutral education. Education will codify assumptions about truth, authority, human nature, and purpose. Early education was Bible-based. It was based on character development. Not only just educating the facts of life, but creating good character in the students. The goal was formation. not just information, shaping character, shaping conscience, and covenant identity, so that we knew what God wanted us to be, and we understood that. That's why the ABCs in the beginning of our nation were all linked to biblical scriptures. I can't tell them, I didn't look at them, I didn't think of that, but A is this or something. Some of you who do this know that. Public education changed that. It became a tool for social progress and natural cohesion. The goal became standardization. Herman Mann and John Dewey were big on this. I'll get into this in a lot of detail later on. But their goal became standardization, producing competent citizens, not necessarily virtuous ones. We can see the effects of that today. As culture changed, as the worldview changed from Bible-centered to man-centered, we saw freedoms erode, we saw the individual decrease, and we saw the state increased. And we saw our freedoms limited. I don't know that it's over yet. So, worldviews change cultures. They change the guardrails that keep us safe and keep us focused. But historical events also change worldviews. And the bigger the event is, the more widespread and enduring the worldview shift is going to be. The collapse of Rome was a huge shift that changed almost everything in its wake. When Rome fell, it left a huge vacuum in leadership, in government, in laws, in everything. The world of that day became totally fragmented, left a huge hole in society, and the worldview shifted from the Roman Greek emphasis to the Christian emphasis. Not quite overnight, but within about 200 years. Huge shift because of the fall of Rome. And that gap allowed Christianity to flourish and expand rapidly. I don't know if I'll get into it today, but very shortly we will. And I want to show how Christianity spread. It was amazing how it spread in the first 200 years after Christ. Absolutely stunning. We'll get to that. Reformation was the second major event that occurred in 1517, and it upset the prevalent religious structure of the day. That was a huge upheaval. We read it in books, it's words on pages, but the effect that it had on the people at that time was huge. The Roman Catholic Church didn't collapse, but it lost almost all its power. And that was a big deal. That was very little different from Rome falling. And just as Rome's collapse left a vacuum for religious authority, the Reformation fractured that authority again, this time along national lines. I can't think of the word I want. One of the effects of this, well, first of all, it disrupted dominant religious worldview. It decentralized spiritual authority. That's big. It reframed our I should stick closer to my notes here. It reframed shaping our understanding of the world in very many ways. It greatly reshaped the worldviews of the day. Indirectly, this is where I wanted to go with this. Indirectly, one of the effects of the Reformation was the rise of the nation states. With the fall of Rome, the cohesion of Europe was gone, and nations started developing. Nations started rising out of that. The Reformation was not totally responsible for that, but it certainly aided and abetted it. That was huge. The Reformation really helped national identity, and nationalism swept and became a weapon in sort. Authority decentralized from the Catholic Church into each new nation. National identities were formed around language, religion, and geographical territory. They were new things. Combined with other trends in society, the new nations began competing for resources, for colonies, for prestige. They built huge armies. They looked to expand. They looked to gain wealth. They looked to gain power. All those sorts of things. That became the impetus for World War I. World War I was the kind of a war that should have never happened. It was triggered simply by national desires for power, basically. The nations of that day started organizing different coalitions. They fought together. The assassination of the Duke ended up starting that war. It should have never happened, but it did happen. Happened largely because of uncontrolled greed and desire for power. But it set the stage for World War II because the Treaty of Versailles put so heavy a burden on Germany that Germany rebelled. And Germany fed even more into national identity and added genetic purity and racial destiny. And that set off World War II. They were huge impacts on culture that we don't often see and think of and recognize, but they changed so many things. War is not a good deal. It's not a good idea. It's necessary at times, but it shouldn't be the first resort. It should be the last resort. You know, we need to know that. We need to understand that. In America, the Civil War, the World War I, and World War II had devastating impacts on our nation. In each case, the loss of men during the fighting and through deaths altered the emotional and economic landscape. Family structures were altered. Strained labor markets were strained because all of a sudden the people weren't there to do the work anymore, not the way they were before. And generational continuity was ruined. If you take out the fathers and grandfathers of a generation, you lose contact with that past. You lose a sense of who you are. And that's not easy to replace. But it happened. Family structures were changed. Widows, single-parent households, orphan children became more common. Women and minorities ended up filling industrial roles and reshaping the workforce demographics. Things changed. All of a sudden, women were leaving the home, leaving motherhood, leaving child raising, and going into the marketplace. That changed the raising of children. That changed family dynamics. And again, as I said, we lost generational continuity. We lost that connection in all those deaths to the past, that we had a personal connection. That's not a good thing. We need parents, we need grandparents, we need great-grandparents there to help and guide us. They have wisdom, they have understanding, they bring a lot to the table. And you take them out of the picture and you lose stuff. As I said, it forced women out of the home and into the workforce, who would have not done that otherwise. During World War II, over 19 million worked for wages, 5 million for the first time, many in heavy industry. Civil War era women stepped into roles as nurses, factory workers, and even organizers, social activists. And there's a number of things I read in the past on that, of the things that they got involved in. The shift changed traditional roles for models, the traditional role models for men and women, and laid the groundwork for the later feminist movement. We can trace a lot of what we see today by the changes that occurred because of the war. It's there. We just don't think about it. It led to changes between the relationship of men and women, marriage and sex. Have a lot of that for later on in the course. It challenged sexual norms, especially during wartime. All these young men went out to war, and they changed how they looked at sex and how they looked at women. And it changed a lot in society for a lot of people. The mass separation of spouses and partners led to new forms of intimacy, one report said. Infidelity rose. Emotional substitution came into place. Things like war brides, pen pal romances, and temporary marriages were never there before. But because of the changed circumstances of the men in the war, it changed. War's cultural aftershocks didn't just reshape the labor and family. It cracked open inherited the normality of sex and gender as we understand it. A new sexual liberation emerged. Increased premarital sex among youth. The rise of Playboy and the pornographic media. The normalization of contraceptions and sexual education. The early stirrings of the LGBTQ movement and their visibility and resistance sprang up. A lot of that's right after World War II, but it's there, and we can trace it back. The war acted as a catalyst that fractured norms and force societies to renegotiate boundaries of intimacy, gender, and identity. We're living with that today. And clearly, we're living with that today. So this all leads me to this point. Now let me back up for a minute. After World War II, the big event that occurred was the 60s. My generation. I admit it. I claim responsibility. I was part of it. But that decade put all of these changes on steroids and really did damage. Really did damage. We didn't see it at the time. We just lived out what we thought was fun. But looking back on it, I can see the damage that was done. I have a whole thing on that later. Anyway, this leads me to this point. The consequence of ideas. Ideas have consequences. And we need to recognize that. We need to understand that. In 1948, Richard Weaver wrote a book called Ideas Have Consequences. And he was one of the first people to look at philosophy and see how it has changed our perception of reality and what it has done for us. R.C. Sproul, I don't have the date here, just recently, wrote another book called The Consequence of Ideas, in which he explores the history of Western philosophy and its impact on human thought and nature. People are waking up to the damage that philosophy has done to the nation and the impact of that. Some of it we see, a lot of it we don't. The point is, ideas have consequences, but bad ideas have victims. We don't often see that. Modern slavery is dehumanizing. You know, biblical slavery was not necessarily dehumanizing, it was reconstructive for the most part. You fell into debt, you went into a wealthy Israelite home in order to pay off that debt and learn how to live properly. You know, that was a lot of it. Not all of it, but a lot of it. Slavery today is a whole different kind of thing. It's dehumanizing. Today, there are 50 million people in slavery. More than ever before. That includes forced labor, human trafficking, debt bondage, forced marriage, and other forms of exploitations where a person is in a situation that is almost impossible for them to leave. Communism was forced conformity. We looked at that a minute ago. The end goal of communism was more important than human life. They were determined to bring in a utopia where everybody was equal and everybody was the same, and if you didn't like it, you were forced into it. And as a result, as many as 175 million were killed in the 20th century due to communism. And that's probably a conservative estimate, we're not sure. Islamic values clash with Western values, and we have terrorism today. Darwinism devalued human life. Humans are no longer special. Life is cheap. We evolved from animals. We're just dirt. Fancy dirt, but we're just dirt. And as a result of that, since 1973, 65 million abortions occurred in America. Around 900,000 murders. One source said this: abortions outnumber murders by almost 2 orders of magnitude, or 100 times more, which is true. Drug deaths, 100,000 in 2021 alone. Suicide rate, around 33% between 1999 and 2019. Suicide. I don't recall the statistics, but the suicide rate among veterans is tragic. Absolutely tragic. We teach men how to kill when they go into the army. We don't teach men how to not kill when they come out of it. And we're reaping the benefits of that. Euthanasia, assisted suicide. Legislation for that is being proposed around the world, and it is gaining traction all the time. I can envision the day, sadly, where euthanasia may be required, or assisted suicide, whatever. You know, we have today bioethics and genetic selection. We can apparently create designer babies for whoever wants them. Nobody is thinking about, just because we can do it, should we do it? We're not asking that question. We can do it. Let's go for it. Think about the results later. That's not a good thing. That ideas have consequences. It goes without saying that any worldview is distorted by sin. We need to keep that in mind. We all deal with that. Even in societies like America, where we had a good government, a good system, freedom, we still deal with sin. We need to understand that. And salvation is there for us in order to give us the tools to restrain the sin in us. And we need to do that. Our choices can have bad consequences. They need to be managed and controlled just as much as culture, just as much as society. So, with worldviews, we looked at two of them. We looked at generally a worldview and normal worldviews and a biblical worldview. There are only two choices. We need to recognize that. There is one God and there is His truth. And that governs all of life. The second choice is one that relies on man's reasoning and thinking. There might be one God, there might be many gods, there might be no gods. And we determine truth based on our own thinking and reasoning and logic. Whatever we think is good is good. Whatever we think is true is true. The first one is biblical. The second one is a worldview based on man's thinking. It does not account for the sin nature in man. Romans 1:22 says, professing themselves wise, they became fools. 1 Corinthians 3:18 says, let no man deceive himself. If any man among you seem wise in this world, let him become a fool that he may be wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness to God. We need to recognize that. We need to make sure that what we believe, what we understand, what we think is in alignment with what God says. Totally. And that's where our battle is today. The battle is between worldviews. And most people today do not think like we think. I often accuse the West, or the left, West. I often accuse the left of living in a bubble. And they only talk with people who agree with them and bolster them and that. We do the same thing in a lot of cases. We live in a bubble. We don't know what's going on outside there in the world unless it hits us in the news. But people have stopped thinking the way we think. And we need to know that and understand that. This goes back to the phrase, the quote that I read early on in this from Sun Tzu, the Chinese philosopher around 500. Know your enemy and know yourself. If you know yourself and you know your enemy, you will not be in peril in any battle. If you do not know the enemy or you do not know yourself, you will be in danger in every battle. We need to know ourselves, what we believe, what we understand, what God tells us is right. And we need to know what the enemy is thinking. I think that's where Charlie Kirk shined. He understood who he was dealing with. And he could challenge them at that very point. And we need to understand that. So I want to move on a little bit. I have 15 minutes or so left. What I thought of this morning as I'm coming to church, which is a little late to work it in, is I never even looked at the impact of plagues on worldview. Think bubonic plague, the influenza epidemic of 1917, 19, I forget, and the COVID thing in 2020. They created huge changes in the way we function, in the way we view things. And oftentimes those changes don't revert back. Most of the time they don't revert back. We just live in a new normality. But they had huge effects as well. And there are probably more of them. I just didn't think. In fact, now that I think of it, I will, probably next week at this point, when I look at how Christianity flourished in the first and second centuries, third centuries, what they did was they would go and help plague victims when nobody else wanted to. They were willing to do mercy at the expense of their own life when nobody else wanted to. But I missed all of that. So, A worldview is a lot. This is biblical worldview. This is point 5 on the sheet that I gave you. This is looking at a biblical worldview and what it ought to be, what it is. Don't intend to step on Scott's lesson last year on worldview, but biblical worldview, but I do want to address it from this point of view. Again, a worldview is essentially a theology applied to life. It reflects how a person interprets reality based on their theological belief. Randy Alcorn said this. I thought this was interesting. He said, worldview is a modern word, but it is not a modern concept. The term worldview, he says, is a recent linguistic development, but it embodies what theology always was. It originated by philosophers to organize and unify their ideas and to distinguish their ideas from other people's ideas. He says it used to be called theology or doctrine. And your theology and doctrine shaped how you looked at the world and how you saw things. I thought that was an interesting point. As Randy Alcorn puts it, worldview and theology are practically synonymous in their primary sense. And that's the content and the worldview that we need to look at. Theology is the foundation and worldview is the expression. Pretty much fits what I've said before on all of this. What we believe affects how we look at the world. And he's saying pretty much the same thing. So it is appropriate to examine philosophy as a distinct theology, as distinct from theology, but it's almost the same. And the same distinctions apply. One is based on God, the other is based on man. I will look at theology in the next couple of weeks, or not theology, philosophy rather, and try to point out the progress in philosophy and how we got from one place to this one today. That's an interesting study, and we will go into that. But a biblical theology starts with God and works from there. Theologians take principles in the Bible and organize them into a coherent framework. We call that a systematic theology. God did not give us a systematic theology, I think, for a reason. He wants us to study to show ourselves approved. If he laid it out in a systematic theology format, we wouldn't have to study. What we do have to do is go through and see every place where God talks about a certain thing, put it together and make sense of it. That's a systematic theology. God intends for us to do that. But when we have done that, we have a picture of how God views the world and how he wants us to view the world. That is a biblical worldview. As I said before, it's like putting on lenses to see clearly. We put on a biblical lens in order to see the world clearly. We need to see the world as God sees it. We need, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians 10, we need to bring into captivity every thought to the obedience of God. Sin distorts not only behavior, but also how we interpret truth, beauty, justice, and identity. And we need to know that, and we need to incorporate that. Sin distorts everything. We need to recognize that and deal with that. There was a song, I have it somewhere in my notes, I don't see it at the moment. In the 1970s, there was a group called, a couple called Henry and Hazel Slaughter. They printed a song and sang it in those days. Let me see this world through your eyes, as if I was looking through your eyes, God. I think I would see the world differently and serve you more fully. We don't hear that song much anymore. I just happen to have it, and every now and then it comes up on my playlist, but not often. That's what a worldview should do, is allow us to see this world as if we were looking through God's eyes and see it the way he sees it. Randy Alcorn continues, he says, people have good worldviews because they have good theology, and bad worldviews because they have bad theology. He's saying what I said, but I got it from him. He didn't get it from me. Francis Schaeffer says, if Christianity is true, then it involves the whole man, including his intellect and his creativeness. Christianity is not just dogmatically true or doctrinally true. Rather, it is true to what is there, true to the whole area of the whole man in all of life. It is all-encompassing. Scottish theologian James Orr said, "He who with his whole heart believes in Jesus as the Son of God is thereby committed to much else besides. He is committed to a view of God, to a view of man, to a view of sin, to a view of redemption, to a view of the purpose of God in creation and history, to a view of human destiny only found in Christianity." Let me read that again. It's a big quote. "He who with his whole heart believes in Jesus as the Son of God is thereby committed to much else. He is committed to a view of God, to a view of man, to a view of sin, to a view of redemption, to a view of the purpose of God in creation and history, to a view of human destiny found only in Christianity." It is a whole world view. Abraham Kuyper, I think he was a Scottish, that doesn't sound right, Danish, I don't know, theologian, he said this, "There is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign, does not cry, 'Mine.' It's all his." Chuck Colson often said our job is to go anywhere and everywhere and cry out, "His," because it all belongs to God. This reminded me of a joke. I've used this before, so bear with me. In this, you'll know this is a joke very shortly. A scientist approached God and said, "We don't need you anymore. We figured out how to create life from dirt, just like you did." God says, "Oh, really? Show me." The scientist bends down and scoops up some dirt, and God says, "That's my dirt. You get your own." It's not going to work. We may think we are smart, but we are not. So, a biblical worldview, again, is based solely on God's revealed truth. Chuck Colson, in his book, How Now Shall We Live, says this, "We must be able to show the world that Christianity is more than a private belief, more than personal salvation. We must show that it is a comprehensive life system that answers all of humanity's age-old questions. Where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? Does life have any purpose or meaning?" That is our task, to show the world that Christianity is more than a private belief, more than personal salvation. It is a comprehensive life system that answers all of our questions. That's our task. It answers the big questions, as I said. Where do we come from? What is man? When we start looking at philosophy, we'll start looking at people who altered the perception of these things. What is right and wrong? Where do we get ethics? Where do we get morality from? What's the meaning of life? What's true? What happens when I die? It answers all of those questions. And it never changes the answer. That's important. The biblical narrative we could call a meta-narrative. That's kind of a new term. I don't think it is, but it's new for most of us. And it's like an overarching narrative that covers everything. We run into it today in the news media because if a story comes out that doesn't fit their narrative, they suppress it. If it fits their narrative, they promote it. You know, we see that happen all the time. But the narrative is whatever they say it is at the moment, and things have to fit into that. God has a bigger narrative. It is a major overriding story of the Bible. It's a meta-narrative that encompasses all of the stories of the Bible. The overriding theme of the Bible. Stories in the Bible are what give it clarity, what fills it out, what makes it more meaningful. It comes in 4 chapters. Those 4 chapters are creation, fall, redemption, restoration, And all of the Bible stories fit into those 4 chapters: creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. I'm going to go into that further in more detail later, but for now, understand this. Creation answers the question of how everything got here. What is behind it all? It gives us identity. It gives us purpose. It explains who we are. Without Genesis, without creation, we are left to flounder in a world of ideas. There is a reason why the first 10 chapters of Genesis are under severe attack today, because they are foundational to everything else in the Bible. It sets the stage, it sets the context for the rest of the story. Second chapter is the fall. It answers the question why things are the way we are. Why do we do bad things? Why do bad things happen to us? That is all answered in the second chapter, the fall. The third chapter is redemption. It answers to the problem of the fall. It gives us hope. There is a way out. Through Jesus Christ, we can be made right with God. The thing separating us is taken out of the way. Our sin is paid for. God's wrath is satisfied, and we can now fulfill God's purpose as He intended it. The fourth part is restoration. That's the plan to make everything new again. It is the culmination or the implementation of what was supposed to be from the beginning. It's the last couple chapters, last 2 chapters of Revelation. It's the ultimate fulfillment of the first 2 chapters of Genesis. And it's a cultural framework that offers what fragmented societies or false worldviews lack. It gives us origin, it gives us meaning, it gives us purpose, and it gives us hope. I said this earlier, and I'll repeat it. God requires that we reshape our thinking to match God's truth. When we become a believer, when we come into the kingdom, we come in with a lot of false ideas, a lot of baggage. We need to put that aside. Paul calls it putting off the old man. And we need to renew our mind, that we can be transformed by the renewing of our mind, that we can prove what is good, acceptable, and perfect. That's God's intention with salvation. It doesn't end at I'm believing I'm going to heaven. It continues with I need to change the way I think. I need to alter my thinking to match what God wants. When a believer is transformed, his thinking ability, his moral reasoning, and spiritual understanding can now assess the world properly. And we will and should only accept what conforms to the will of God. Any other worldview is wholly inadequate for navigating this world. We can look around us and see that. There's no getting away from this. We live in God's world, under His rules, and within His laws. There is no getting away from that. I don't care how you twist it, how you look at it, how you internalize it. Nothing is going to work except what God says works. We can only defeat gravity by enormous cost. Planes aren't cheap. Rockets aren't cheap. Normally we live in the world that God created. We never defy that unless we find a way to work around it. But we don't defeat it. It's always there. We violate it at our own peril. Just jump off a high cliff. I'll never do that because I won't go on the high cliff to begin with. So you understand that. But you do, and you're going to get hurt. God requires that we reshape our thinking to His view. It's interesting, in the Garden of Eden, man would have had a pure biblical worldview. I long for that day. I really do. Unfallen man in a perfect garden with the God of the universe walking beside him. What I would give to know that. Well, I will someday. But it wouldn't hurt for a little of it now. Initially, God walked with man in the garden. He had fellowship, probably much instruction about the world and life. I'm certain that God would be telling Adam, this is how you work. This is what's going to happen. This is what you can expect. You need to do this or that or the other thing. Understand this. Can you imagine being taught by God Himself in person? I can't. But it's exciting to think about. He gave man the task of having children and having dominion over creation. He gave us purpose. Initially, there was nothing to interfere with that understanding of God and the understanding of the world that God gave us. Nothing to interfere. Our task today is to overcome what happened in between with the fall and try to see the world properly and to tell others, this is how the world ought to work. This is how things ought to happen. God's view of the world is different from our view. I've often thought, what does he think when he looks at us? I mean, we see, you're all nice people. What does he see? Twisted, corrupted sinners? I don't know. I know he loves us, or he wouldn't have come and died for us. But what does he see? We don't see that. We live in our little shell, so to speak, I think. Anyway, next week, I'll start with number 6. Christianity is the application of the biblical worldview. And we're going to go into this. We're going to look at the spread of Christianity in the first couple centuries and how that worked. That's a fascinating study and revealing as well. Anyway, let's pray. Let's close. Father, thank you for this time. Thank you for your wisdom and your goodness. Thank you that you have given us all that we need. Just help us to use it and to apply it, to honor you and glorify you. And we'll thank you for this in Jesus' name. Amen.